Welcome, friends and comrades. Daniel here. A quick word before we turn to the interview with Mohammed Sulaiman. So I conducted this interview with Mohammed on Monday night, October 30th. Today it's October 31st, 2023. And I just learned that the refugee camp in which Mohammed was raised as a young boy, the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, was bombed, resulting in the deaths of several dozen people, and many others are currently under the rubble being dug out as we speak. This is a very tense time. This is a tragic war, the Israel-Hamas war. I have conducted an interview with a Jewish and a Muslim philosopher, which you can see on the channel, as well as on my podcast, the Emancipations podcast. Please subscribe. Please listen either in audio or video form, whatever you prefer. Let me say two things before I turn to the interview. We approach this conversation with an analytic approach, with an academic approach. Mohammed, at the same time, is a Palestinian born into Gaza. So he knows firsthand the rise of Hamas, the status of Hamas within the Palestinian and Gazan society. So we listen with that understanding, that embodied perspective brings with it the experiences. Mohammed has lived himself through at least 2 or 3 Israeli incursions over the last 2 decades. This current incursion is of an unprecedented scale in its brutality. So we do not, and I do not, somehow support Hamas in everything that it does. I rather, again, approach this with an interest in learning about the conditions that brought Hamas into existence and where this conflict might be headed. We are here to learn. Finally, it must be said, and I am a long-standing champion of anti-racism, especially I am an advocate of preventing and mitigating Islamophobic racism as well as anti-Semitic racism. In the fog of war, never allow anti-Semitic discourses to get the best of you. Never allow your hatred, which is justified, for the American and the Israeli war effort and the brutal genocidal actions of that war machine to allow you to blame Jewish people, many of whom are themselves critical of the very war machine itself. So with that, I hope you enjoy this interview. All right. Welcome, friends and comrades. Daniel here with Mohammed Sulaiman, coming at us from South Australia, where he's a lecturer in sociology. But Mohammed is actually originally from Gaza. We follow one another on Twitter and have a mutual interest in the work of Salman Sayed, who Mohammed actually did his Ph.D. dissertation with Salman, and maybe his work will come up in our conversation later. But Mohammed, thank you so much. This is incredibly difficult circumstances in which we meet. I wanted to start off, Mohammed, to give the audience a bit more of the situation. Having been born and raised in Gaza, what was it like, as a young boy? Give us a sense of your background and what life was like growing up in Gaza.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Daniel. So yeah, I wasn't actually born in Gaza. I was born in Saudi Arabia. My father, my grandfather are from Gaza. So I was born in Saudi Arabia, where my father used to work. And then at the age of 6 years, I moved back to my hometown, to Gaza, where my family come from, my extended family. But they don't really come from Gaza. They come from a city which is now in Israel, called, or it's a town called Algeria, just in the vicinity of Ashkelon. So it's in nowadays Israel. And I grew up in a refugee camp. So at the age of 6, I went back to Palestine, to Gaza, from Saudi Arabia after, my father's work permit expired. So the whole family went back to Gaza, where my extended family live. They lived in a refugee camp, the largest refugee camp in Gaza, which is Jabalia, which is currently being completely or has already been completely destroyed. It's in the north of Gaza. I went to a United Nations school as a young boy at the age of 6 and 7, the also largest UN school, UNRWA school in Jabalia. I completed most of my primary education at the United Nations school called Al Fakhura, or in fact, the official name of the school is Averroes Ibn Rushd, after the eminent Islamic philosopher of the medieval Spain. So the same school that I went to got directly attacked by the Israeli forces in 2008, 2009, when Israel launched its first large-scale military operation on Gaza called Operation Cast Lead. And a lot of civilians were taking shelter in the school. And similar to what we see today, dozens of children and families were murdered in the attack on the United Nations school that I completed my primary education at. So we're talking here mid-1990s. So I grew up in the refugee camp, and basically in the early 2000s, as I started my secondary school education, the Second Palestinian Intifada erupted. Basically, Intifada is the Arabic word for uprising. So that Intifada is known for the violent format that it basically adopted in response to the Israeli brutal occupation and brutalization of Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and inside Israel. So that's basically the formative period that most fundamentally shaped my consciousness, my upbringing, my identity, who I am as an individual, my place in the world. And basically, during that time, I grew up to the images of Mohammed Ad-Durra, who people know around the world, the young boy, basically of a similar age to me. He was shot by Israeli soldiers as he was hiding behind his father, behind some sort of a large stone cylinder, and then they got caught in the crossfire. The Israeli soldiers saw the young boy and his father, and they couldn't get away from the crossfire, so they basically started shooting directly and deliberately towards the young boy. Most people will know what I'm talking about, but if some people don't, it's Mohammed Ad-Durra. So that was basically something that got inculcated in my memory as a young boy. The images of Faris Oda, the young boy who was standing before a tank and basically throwing a stone at the tank. So these are the circumstances I grew up in. Palestinians on the ground standing up to the Israeli army that simply dispossessed us in 1948, kicked out my grandparents from our cities in our land in nowadays Israel, and throughout our lives continued to massacre, incarcerate, torture, and kill Palestinians, basically, for fun, really.
So the conditions in Gaza when you were a young boy, could you talk about them in relationship to the conditions following 2007, 2008, when Hamas comes to power? Talk about the difference in the way of life, the feeling, the reception of Hamas, because Hamas was not in power when you were young.
That is right. So yeah, of course. So we can definitely, I mean, at least personally speaking, my my life in Gaza can be divided into those two periods: before and after Hamas, or before and after Hamas. So what happened is, as I said, before Hamas, in the early 2000s, throughout the 1990s, when the Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah, Yasser Arafat, was in charge, basically similar to what we have in the West Bank today. They had those security and intelligence agreements, security collaboration to crack down on any form of Palestinian resistance, any form of native Palestinian resistance. So all of these people were basically locked up by the Palestinian Authority, including someone like my uncle, who had affiliations with resistance groups. So these people first were imprisoned in Israeli jails, and then transferred to Palestinian jails under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority and under those kinds of collaboration agreements, in order to quell all kinds of Palestinian resistance, all forms of it, civil, violent, non-violent, all of it. So that's the main period. But like I said, that's when the second intifada erupted, and Hamas played a fundamental role in that intifada through the suicide bombings that, kind of also defined the current image of a lot of people of what Hamas is about. Because the only way that Palestinians could resist at the time is through kind of infiltrating into into occupied Palestinian territory, both in Gaza, because at the time there were Israeli soldiers, there were Israeli troops in Gaza, and of course in the West Bank and elsewhere. So many members of the resistance groups, mainly Hamas, Islamic Jihad, but also secular parties, left-wing parties like the Public Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the left-wing Marxist group, other secular parties, nationalist groups like Fatah. So a lot of these people, like growing up, including my neighbors, my friends, you would hear that, they go into their heads, and they decided to, basically sacrifice their lives to try and attack Israeli soldiers. So for Palestinians, quite frankly, the goal is to fight, to resist. Every Palestinian knows that, because as a Palestinian in Palestine, you just have no life. And the only way you can sort of express your humanity, your fundamental existence as a human being, is to resist the people that are basically depriving you of any semblance of humanity. So here, what happened is, after the Intifada, Hamas became very widely popular amongst Palestinians. It had always been popular, but with the Intifada, it gained even more popularity due to its stance as a resistance group. And then there were the elections, the first kind of democratic elections in the Middle East, so-called Middle East. That's before the Arab Spring, before any of those things happened. The first experience with democratic elections in the region happened in Gaza, in Palestine, in Gaza. And Palestinians, of course, as always, anywhere in the Arab and Muslim world, when people actually have a chance to vote democratically and freely, they will elect people that they feel represent them. And most of these people will come from groups that are still connected to Islamic history and Islamic culture, because these people are Muslim. It's just some people want to impose their secular understanding on this part of the world, and that, for you to be free, you must be secular or liberal, and so on and so forth. They don't understand that this is something that is rather unique and organic to Western societies. Perhaps in certain parts of the Arab world, some are starting to adopt that, but that's not actually organic and indigenous to the formation of these societies, these kinds of ideologies. People there are Muslim, whether people like it or not. This is the truth. This is the fact. People are grounded, their culture, their ideas are all rooted in Islamic history, Islamic civilization, in the Quran, in the Sunnah. This is what people do. Their names, their ideas, all of that. So people voted for Hamas. Overwhelmingly, Hamas now became officially the government of Gaza. So that
2006, 2007.
Correct, 2006, 2007. So that was the legislative parliamentary, basically, elections. in Gaza, the legislative elections. And Hamas, like I said, won the majority vote. So it became the government. Of course, that created a problem for international for the international community, mainly in the Arab region, both in the Arab region and in the West, because Hamas is an Islamist group. So that fundamentally shapes how people deal with Hamas and how people talk about Hamas. They don't see it as essentially Palestinian; they see it as essentially an Islamist group. But
could you tell us a little bit more about this notion of Islamist politics? There's a whole spectrum. There's many orientations of Islamism which are not always necessarily political. I mean, you have different versions of Salafism which are very apolitical, in fact. Then you have versions of Salafism which are political, right? So could you give us a brief genealogy of Islamist politics and how Hamas fits onto the spectrum in general?
Of course. Just before I actually answer that question, I will just continue with the narrative about Hamas in Gaza and then explain how Hamas is different from all other Islamist groups that exist and that existed in the past and exist in the present. Hamas is unique in its character, in its formation, in its history, and in its roots. So after Hamas got elected, that created a problem for the international community because Hamas does not recognize Israel. It just does not even recognize its legitimacy to exist on Palestinian land. So that means that no one from the international community will be willing to engage with Hamas as a legitimate, rational actor, because this idea that you have to give assurances that you're willing to make peace. Hamas said, of course, they're willing to make peace, but they're not willing to compromise. And that's basically the majority Palestinian voice. That the PLO, when they recognized Israeli legitimacy on Palestinian land, that was mainly as a result of first lack of democratic representation. They did not really speak for all Palestinians, even though everybody goes on nowadays talking about how the PLO is the official representative of the Palestinians. Well, that's an outdated notion. It no longer is. In fact, Hamas is more representative of Palestinians, at least in Gaza. And I would say after this genocide now of the entire Palestinian community everywhere, and I would say of the Arab world. Now I'm talking about people on the ground. I'm talking about public perception of Hamas as a Palestinian resistance group that fights against foreign invasion and foreign interests in Muslim and Arab countries. So Hamas then became penalized, punished for its position, which is rejecting the legitimacy and refusing to renounce violence as a means of resisting the Israeli occupation. What that meant is that the EU led a campaign to boycott, to impose a blockade on Hamas, to suffocate Hamas in Gaza, which of course everybody knows is a kind of collective punishment. Again, I wouldn't even use the same international law and human rights rhetoric, because I think it's fundamentally the reason why Palestinians are still oppressed. Because just to say that it's collective punishment is to assume that they have a right to punish Hamas in the first place. Well, you don't have a right to punish Hamas, let alone to collectively punish people inside Gaza who live under Hamas rule. So then what happened is they imposed a blockade, which started, like you said, in 2006, 2007, and continues until today. And it continued to be sort of getting more tighter, more violent, more hermetic, more violent, more military, basically truly devoiding all aspects of human life, human agency, any semblance of freedom. I personally grew up, like I said, in Gaza at that time as well. After 2006, I was still in high school. There were efforts to try and topple Hamas by finding certain factions in Palestine, like the Fatah faction after the death of Yasser Arafat. And basically, Hamas quelled those internal civil or sort of internal conflicts. It was a violent period also in Gaza. I was doing my high school exams, I was writing my answers, and there were people around my school gangs, people shooting at each other, and it was Hamas trying to basically basically impose law and order against these people, because they were trying to again topple Hamas, and they were funded by particular elements in the Arab world, mainly the Emirates, which is now one of the main actors in silencing Arab solidarity with the Palestinian people. So this is the background to this conflict, because everything that happened after that is simply how Hamas continued to entrench its power in Gaza in order to launch an organized resistance attack against the Zionist entity, which continued to massacre, blockade Palestinians in Gaza. And we know since 2006 until this point, what happened is there were numerous large-scale aerial bombardment campaigns during which thousands and thousands of Palestinians were massacred. I lived through many of those in 2008, 2009, in 2012. During that attack, I got nearly killed by an Israeli airstrike that, struck me. There is recordings of me on the CNN when I was doing a live interview, and my building got shelled, and, I got cut off while I was doing a live interview. So this is not new to Palestinians. That's why I don't believe that this is the first genocide in Gaza. There have been many genocides before this one. This is the final genocide that Israel is launching in order to this is truly the equivalent of the final solution to truly eradicate the presence of Gaza, just wipe it off the face of the earth, get rid of it, so that there is no longer this nuisance, this kind of headache that Israel has to deal with, this tiny strip of land where all the resistance always comes from, and where Israel just cannot have peace after it has normalized its relations with everyone in the Arab world. There is that piece of land where there is still resistance, where there is still people who insist on basically their right to their land, to their history. So this is about history making as well. And that's what I'm saying, where we see all these kind of ramifications for that debate around the global world order, around the notions of human rights and humanity and liberalism and Islamism and all of that. Now, I'm happy to comment more on, the idea of Islam and Hamas as an Islamist movement and how that's different from other Islamist groups. But fundamentally, Hamas is a Palestinian group. It's made of Palestinians. It's not made of foreigners. There is not a single foreigner. There are people from the Arab world who can join Hamas, but they will not join the military brigades of Hamas, the military wing of Hamas, because Hamas comes from Palestine. It started in Gaza in the 1950s as a charity group, a conservative Islamic, social conservative Islamic group, just basically welfare activities, social support, events, things like that. And then it continued to develop. And then in the first Intifada, in the late 1980s, in 1987, the first Intifada, which, unlike the second Intifada that I mentioned earlier, was mainly a non-violent Intifada, mass civil disobedience, mainly rock throwing. Again, that's violent and that's terrorist, as we know. Everything that you do is violent and is terrorist. Everything you do is just going to be murdered, and you're going to be called terrorist because you just don't have no right to exist in the first place. So again, Hamas during that time basically was founded as an official Palestinian resistance movement, but of course it's grounded in Islamic history, in Islamic culture, in Islamic ideology, in social Islamic conservatism. So what that means is people are, again, and this is the majority of people in Palestine. Okay, this is my family. People in Palestine are Muslim. They're conservative. Whether people in the West like it or not, that's something they can deal with. The truth is, this is what Muslims are like. Now, we want them to, that's the idea of how the West simply facilitates the genocide of these people by seeing them as this human, because they're not as secular and liberal as they want them to be. Now, Hamas, like I said, that's the main Islamic character of it, is that also it adopted the idea of course, it started as a branch, because it was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the mother organization of Hamas was the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And then Hamas simply branched out from the Muslim Brotherhood and became the Palestinian branch of that. And that, of course, was also different in the sense that it adopted violence as a means. I wouldn't say violence, but armed resistance. It adopted armed resistance because it had a reason to fight, not like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who also used violence, for example, against Anwar Sadat in 1978, was assassinated by an Islamist figure. But that's different from Hamas because Hamas wasn't interested in fighting against Arabs or fighting against Muslims. Hamas' mission, Hamas' orientation, Hamas' purpose was to fight the Zionist occupation of Palestine. It's Palestinians. They had affiliations with Islamist ideology, with Islamist parties, Islamist culture, but they're Palestinians. They're refugees from Jabalia refugee camp, from Ash-Shati refugee camp, from Khan Yunis refugee camp, from the 5 refugee camps that are densely populated and in the Gaza Strip. So this is where the Hamas is concentrated, in those refugee camps. These people simply, like I said, there are mosques there or everywhere. This is where people gather. They exchange ideas. They read the Quran. They talk. They make friends. This is their community. This is their society. And then, of course, some of them choose to become officially members of Hamas. Some of them join the military wing, train, think of ways that they can wage organized resistance against the Israeli occupation. They're Palestinians fighting against the Israeli occupation. Now, their ideology, their thinking, of course, is grounded in the ideas of political Islam, what we call political Islam, mainly Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt, Sayyid Qutb. Of course, we know in the what people in the West call the ideologue of political Islam. So, and who was also, this is the interesting part, who was also killed. What's the word? Basically, he was in prison in Egypt, and he received a death sentence for his activism and for his ideology. So these are the idols of political Islam, and Hamas is influenced by these idols, but they galvanize that narrative to fight against Israel, not to fight against Arabs or to fight against Muslims. Now, there is a lot going on now, how in the Arab world they see Hamas as a threat because of its close relationship with those Islamist parties, which pose the biggest threat to the established regimes in the Arab world, which explains mainly why they are completely apathetic to what is going on in Palestine, because they have just as much of a vested interest in getting rid of Hamas as Israel and the West. So I'm talking about regimes like in the United Arab Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, which controls the only border with Palestinians in Gaza, but continues to refuse to open the border just to let food and water, because it's also, Egypt is now more or less a proxy, it's a proxy to the United Arab Emirates, to the Gulf, liberal international agenda, which is open up the Gulf, normalize with Israel, and Egypt is sort of, a proxy in that. So they are using that to completely suffocate Hamas, and Hamas is simply kind of the last obstacle in the road, for fully normalizing the Middle East. And Hamas simply is an obstacle that must be removed. And that's why now they're going all in to just simply eradicate all of Gaza, eradicate all of Hamas. To eradicate Hamas, you must eradicate all of Gaza. That's what's going on.
Now, Hamas's charter has modified in recent times. Can you speak to this? Because you said a moment ago that the charter was established originally for the eradication of the Zionist entity, in your phrase. However, my understanding now is that they've modified. They've become slightly more conciliatory. They're talking about 67 borders would be permissible. What does this mean? Does this mean that Hamas is trying to become more diplomatic, more strategic?
Yeah, of course. Hamas has shown so much growth and maturity over the years. Like, what they did, for example, in the early 2000s in the second intifada with those suicide bombings, that's something they've learned from. They would never do anything like that these days. What I mean is kind of this idea of simply embedding yourself within civilian population and just blowing them to pieces. They used to do that. Now they don't do that. They actually adopt proper professional military tactics where they fight simply against the army. They are also trying to present themselves as an internationally responsible, mature, and rational actor who has legitimate demands and grievances. And part of that, of course, was amending their charter in 2015, basically to accept sort of the idea that Israel can exist on lands occupied in 1948, but a Palestinian state can be established in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem being the capital, which wasn't in the original charter. The original charter called for basically expelling the sort of Zionist society from Palestine, something basically which is unrealistic and unattainable. So they did revise that, and that was also part of their initiative and their effort to try and bridge the gap between them and the Palestinian Authority, because like I said, there is a fundamental division within the Palestinian leadership between Palestinian parties. Hamas being, clear about its strategy and its ideology, which is resistance, liberation of Palestine. But then we have the Palestinian Authority, which is simply, Israel can have everything. They're just happy with some sort of a demilitarized Bantustan state, on, really fragmented bits and pieces in the West Bank, probably even without Gaza now. So that's not really acceptable for Palestinians as a people who truly, I know, will not give up on their right to continue to fight even for years and years to come. They will continue to fight. They will still be there, and they will find ways to mobilize themselves and make themselves present, make their presence felt, and make their voices heard in any way possible. So Hamas is now, I believe, is a much more mature, rational actor than it was. I don't believe that, the idea, I do believe that they have a right to use violence. We can talk philosophically about the idea of morality, of what's good and what's bad and what's evil and what's barbaric, and all these terms that are thrown around to delegitimize Palestinians' self-defense. Now, all these ideas that now some of the liberal and Zionist sensibility will be offended because, they kill people. Well, this is not an individual issue here. This is a fundamentally political struggle. No one is celebrating the death of a child or a woman or anything like that. That's what Zionists do, really. They have, a reputation for that. We never go on TV and celebrate. Even when we celebrate resistance acts, we don't celebrate that death of individual. We celebrate the act itself as a political act. We celebrate that we are still here, that Palestinians still exist, that we are not going away. So when Palestinians celebrate Hamas, they celebrate Hamas or resistance in the sense that, whatever you do, we are still going to be here and we are still going to make our voices heard. That's agency. Agency is political action. Political action, and the most primary political action, is waging self-defense in an organized way where you can inflict harm on the enemy. Now, we can discuss the technicalities, but this is not about people's individual moral sensibility. This is about the political statement that Hamas can make by waging these kinds of attacks. So if we look at what happened, Hamas waged an attack on Israeli soldiers, not on Israeli civilians. When Hamas wanted to infiltrate into Israel, it had first to engage the military. It had to engage the Gaza elite unit. It had to face. So that's their confrontation. That's how they work. They're not going after civilians like the narrative is trying to portray them. They were going after the Israeli army because the border is controlled by the Israeli army. We have the Iron Wall. We have all this, this technology, this basically system that is based on the dehumanization and the utter control of Palestinians. Hamas managed to neutralize that, to completely destroy that, to eliminate that unit within a matter of hours. So that's a military statement. That's a military tactic. That's not an attack. That's not an attack on civilians. Now, of course, after that, they infiltrated. We can discuss the technicalities of the attack, the alleged atrocities, some of which may well have happened. We don't know, but I am sure innocent people were killed. That's not the point now, because that's not a deliberate attack on civilians. That's not an attack that was mainly targeting civilians. That was an attack that targeted the Israeli military state and its occupying power. I'm not a Hamas member myself. That's why I can speak freely about the issue. But people want to be invested in the details of Hamas attack, not to focus on the fundamental justness and morality of that attack as an attack that wanted to reposition Palestinians as a people, unite them as a people against the Zionist occupation. And of course, we understand now why Hamas was right to wage that attack, because that has always been Israel's plan, which is to completely ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and get rid of them, as it has been doing in the West Bank, where Hamas does not maintain a significant presence, where most Hamas members are in Israeli jails, but it has continued to ethnically cleanse them, expel them from their lands, incarcerate them. Thousands and thousands of people are in administrative detentions. They don't even know for how long they're going to be in jail. They don't know where they're going to be released. They're sitting in prison cells. Children, right? They don't know when they wake up if they're going to go home or going to stay in prison. Imagine the kind of psychological torment, the psychological torture, all kinds of sophisticated dehumanization and utter obliteration of the humanity of Palestinians. And people then have the audacity to question the morality of Palestinians and call Palestinian attacks atrocious. Now, like I said, I'm not denying, and I don't celebrate, that, on a personal level, but that's not about my personal feelings. My personal feelings now are completely reserved for my people, okay? For Palestinians, for our children who are being massacred en masse on a much larger scale than any Palestinian or Arab or Muslim country could do to Israelis. So there is no comparison here. On the other hand, we have Israel. And what is Israel doing? It's deliberately, with all its military arsenal, with its tanks, its weapons, its heavy machinery, its warplanes, its ships, its nuclear power, its technology, what is it doing? It's massacring children, and people think this is just because children got killed because they were trying to target a Hamas or a terrorist, and then they used a disproportionate amount of force. No. Really, the policy is to kill children. This is a deliberate policy to wipe out this generation, because first, that was their intent, which they blatantly and bluntly stated: we're going to kill all of them, because they truly see you as a terrorist, whether you're Hamas or not. If you're not Hamas yourself, then you are the family of Hamas or the neighbor of Hamas. You're an extension of Hamas. You're an extension of terrorism. You're in the proximity of terrorism. You're a terrorist. You are available for killing. This is the Israeli psyche, the Zionist psyche, which is based on the obliteration of Palestinians as a people. They don't want these people to exist. They're called Arabs. They're called Muslims. And this has always been their plan. So Hamas is not the issue here. It's the Israeli genocidal mentality, the Zionist genocidal mentality. It's always been like that.
Norman Finkelstein, the Jewish advocate for Palestinian rights, has written multiple articles in his analysis of October 7th, where he says what occurred is best analogized to like a slave revolt. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about that, because in the context of slave revolt, the moral structure that you would analyze the use of violence would be of a different quality, and it would therefore then be obviously justified purely from an explanatory point of view. Because I think the people that are the hundreds of thousands, the millions of people that are marching in London, in New York, Washington, D.C., all around the world, not to mention the Muslim countries, which is even bigger. Look at the crowds in Turkey, for example. Those people are not members of Hamas. You're not even a member of Hamas. So the issue is that they try to say that Palestinian cause, Palestinian people are reducible to terrorists. They're reducible to Hamas. So I want everybody listening to understand, and I hope you agree, Mohammed, that this is not the best way to look at this at all. It's more, we are here to clarify and to discuss and to elucidate and to bring some light of knowledge, which is totally blacked out in the Western media. How do you find that analogy, though, first, to Finkelstein? I don't know if you've read it, but just out of curiosity, do you have a thought on that?
Yes. So I think it's a very suitable analogy. Like I agree with it. I do think that this is a fight of slaves, people who are enslaved. Living under occupation is really living under collective enslavement. This is how I felt growing up, that I had absolutely no freedom whatsoever, even though you had a semblance that you lived in Gaza. Because something we forgot to touch on is that before Hamas won the legislative election, why Hamas won the 2006 legislative election is because Israel withdrew from Gaza just the year before that. And that was basically marketed as a victory for Hamas. And I do agree that it was mainly Hamas that led the sort of attacks on Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, which was a factor in the Israeli decision to withdraw from Gaza. Of course, that was part of a bigger plan, which is to isolate Gaza from the West Bank. That was part of a bigger Zionist plan, which is simply to isolate Gaza and then deal with Gaza as some sort of a pariah entity, sort of a enemy territory, Hamas territory, terrorists, separate from the question of Palestine at large. So that was that's what the Israeli press acknowledged. That's quite well known, that it was a plan to isolate Gaza and deal with Gaza under Hamas control as some sort of, like I said, not Palestinians, terrorists. But simply because it's not because they fight, but because they are under an Islamist government, a Hamas government. So that was always part of the Israeli Zionist rhetoric, which is to build allies with anti-Muslim racists, people in the West, mainly right-wingers, Christian Zionists. This is how they work. They live off the notion that Israel fights against Arabs and Muslims, against barbarics, the same, old-fashioned civilizationist narrative that we know. So now Hamas, of course, was or played a huge role in the Israeli decision to withdraw from Gaza, and that was marketed as a victory for Hamas, and people sort of adopted this idea that we must embrace Hamas because Hamas is the resistance, Hamas is the solution. Why did they also say that? Because prior to that, in 1993, so nearly 13 years before Hamas was elected, what happened is that the Palestinians signed the Oslo peace accords under the Palestine Liberation Organization, the so-called official legitimate representative of the Palestinians before the international community. So that was Yasser Arafat when they, shook hands with Isaac Rabin in Norway, and the peace accords were signed. What was the whole idea of the peace accords? That Palestinians, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, would for the first time recognize Israel's legitimacy and its right to exist on Palestinian land. That was the first time in Palestinian history that the Palestinians concede and give Israel the legitimacy, at least rhetorically, and that's the most powerful thing, to exist on Palestinian land. The second condition, that Israel had the right to build its state, to have a state on lands occupied in 1948. And the second condition was that the Palestine Liberation Organization would renounce, and that's fundamental, the use of violence. Now, for me, that's the liquidation of the Palestinian struggle until Hamas, rose to power, because violence is essential. The ability to wage organized warfare is essential for the existence of a people. Without Hamas, Palestinians would simply have no way of being able to wage organized warfare against the Zionist occupation. So, and of course, that's part of the Zionist master plan, which is recognize us, renounce violence, which is simply, you will simply cease to exist. Or if you use violence, you will again justify your own killing, and you were gonna, anyway, they're going to get rid of us, but they wanted to control Palestinians. Before that, the Palestine Liberation Organization was at the forefront of armed resistance, as we know, throughout the 1970s and 80s, mainly the 1970s, with, we know, the Munich attack, and also the Beirut massacres, the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, where the Palestinian militias, the armed groups, were embedded and waging attacks against the Zionist occupation. And the same thing happened where the Israeli troops would go after civilians to try and exterminate all of them, to quell all kinds of resistance against the Zionist occupation. Then they renounced violence. They signed the Oslo Accords, recognized Israel's legitimacy, renounced violence. Now, the idea was, in return, what would Israel give Palestinians? What Palestinians got in return was, first, recognizing the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people, not recognizing the Palestinians' right to have a state or to, independence or anything. No, recognize that the PLO is a rational actor that we can negotiate with. Simply speaking, that's what Palestinians got to read. And people can read about that in all of Edward Said's work, who was directly involved in those negotiations and strongly advised Yasser Arafat against signing the Oslo Accords, and then stepped down from the Palestine Liberation Organization after signing those Oslo Accords, because he knew that was simply signing the death penalty of the Palestinian people. So then they said within a time frame of 5 years, Palestinians will get an independent state. So in 1993, we signed the Oslo Accords. According to this, in 1998, Palestinians would have a state by 1998 in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem being the capital. We know, fast forward 1993, now 2003, 23, it's basically 30 years. Palestinians don't have a state. In fact, what Israel did was entrenched its occupation in the West Bank, built more settlements, imported more Jewish European settlers to live in those massive settlements built inside the West Bank on Palestinian land that is internationally recognized as Palestinian, even according to the same international law that they formulated, and continue to violate. When I say they, I mean, of course, the Axis, the liberal international Zionist bloc. This is how I see it. Absolutely. There's no mincing words here. They are complicit. I mean, there's no need for stating that. It's obvious. So what they did is that they entrenched the occupation, they terrorized Palestinians, they expelled them from the land. We know what they did in Jerusalem, continued to Judaize, to expel Palestinians from East Jerusalem, because it's Judea and Samaria. And that was part of the plan, to isolate Gaza, because they wanted to focus on the West Bank, which for them is the holy part, Judea and Samaria. Of course, basically appeasing the ultra-Orthodox religious elements within the European Jewish settler community, who became more and more popular and started to dominate and become the mainstream Zionist voice. And this is how they got extremely more right-wing over the years. But this is not a right-left-wing issue. This is a Zionist mentality that we're dealing with. It's a Zionist mindset. But these people best represented, just like I say, the right wing and the left wing, most of the time in the United States and the West, simply, not truly divergent. In fact, especially in relation to Arabs and Muslims. But it's the right wing that clearly epitomizes and explicitly expresses this Islamophobia, this racism, whereas the liberals see that as a threat because it displaces this idea that we are inclusive, liberal, universal, and diverse. But of course, we know that's not really the case when, it's only when it's convenient, as we know, like you recognize in Australia the right of indigenous people. Well, of course, you have no problem with doing that because it's not going to threaten your privilege. unlike what goes on in Palestine, where we see the contrast. These people are truly destabilizing the whole world order, and that's where this genocidal, dehumanization of Palestinians comes to the fore from across the liberal Western spectrum. When I say that, of course, I mean political. On everything I say, I'm talking on a political level. Some people don't understand that and think, this is an individualistic thing, that, you can have your individualistic morality as a Westerner, as a white person, of course, and we can be brothers and we can be friends, but this is not about you and me. This is about leaderships. This is about the history makers. We as individuals, as we can see, have absolutely no agency, and particularly people in the West who have always believed in this illusion of freedom and agency. Now they witness a genocide that they are completely averse to, that they are completely opposed to, but can do absolutely nothing about to stop it. They can't stop it. They're telling the governments, they're protesting 500,000 people, but they are simply powerless. That's the truth. So we don't have power. We don't have agency like we are being told. Now, back to the question of Hamas. Now, we didn't get a state. Hamas became more and more embedded in Gaza, entrench its militant capacity. Now, when I say militant capacity, Hamas doesn't own a tank, a plane, nothing of that conventional weaponry that we know. Hamas doesn't own any of these things because it's under blockade, economic blockade, diplomatic blockade, military blockade. All, people suffer in Palestine from this blockade. It's suffocating. You have no electricity. Growing up in Gaza, having electricity is a privilege. Having a full day of electricity is unheard of. People get electricity all the time, 6 to 8 hours on, 6 to 8 hours off. This is a daily rhythm. There's no movement. I came to Australia. It was a traumatic experience having to come to Australia from Gaza after 2014, the longest war that Israel waged on Gaza, on Hamas in Gaza, which lasted 54 days and in which 2,500 Palestinians were killed. But just to keep a perspective on things, in 54 days in 2014, Israel killed 2,400 Palestinians in one of the deadliest wars on Gaza. So far, they've killed 8,000 people in 22 or 23 days. So Hamas built its militant capacity simply they thought that Hamas would simply, by isolating it, they focus on the West Bank, they can take over the West Bank, and then they can just isolate Gaza, basically like it didn't exist. Simply, it's just there. We don't have to worry about it. We build a wall, and we just control them. And this is what we know. It's just they completely underestimated the power and the will of these people, the desire to be free. Is this a slave attack? Is this an attack or a self-defensive act? I wouldn't say it's exactly equivalent to that kind of analogy, because it is an organized. This is important to stress, the organized form of this. This is not a random disorganized. This is not ISIS stuff. This is not Al-Qaeda stuff. This is not these kind of so-called terrorist acts. This is a proper, mature, semi-professional military group that knows what it's doing. They have a sophisticated understanding of military strategy. And like I said, when they waged an attack, they waged it on the Israeli army. This is factual. Like, to get into Israel, you had to engage the army. You had to eliminate the army. They held hostages, of course, because the Israeli army has been taking thousands and thousands of Palestinians prisoners, and they wanted to, defend themselves and free their own children from Israeli jails. So this is where people start sort of depoliticizing everything, because they're saying, but Hamas, both sides, I'm sorry, you are complicit. If you go down this path, you're complicit in the genocide, because you're delegitimizing Hamas attack and you are fueling the Zionist narrative, which dehumanizes Palestinians and tries to divide them by saying Hamas, Palestine, or Gazans, civilians. There is no such distinction in the Zionist mind between civilian and terrorist. Like I said, why should we embrace a distinction that doesn't exist in reality. That doesn't mean we're Hamas, like you said. No, I am not Hamas, but that doesn't also mean that Hamas is not Palestinian. In fact, it's the most Palestinian actor, the most representative Palestinian actor in the world today is Hamas. That, again, doesn't mean every Palestinian is Hamas. But some people then slip into thinking, oh, so Hamas, they're bad guys. No, they're not bad guys.
You invoked Edward Said, and I think that's an interesting point of reflection for people in the West who know very little about Islam or who are fed the Hasbara Israeli propaganda machine. Edward Said's interesting because we know that he had some critique of Hamas, right? I mean, he was not like a member by any means, things of this nature, but we also know that he was a militant Palestinian committed to the collective struggle of liberation without question. How do you think he might answer this question of universal Palestinian rights and the reality of Hamas? Like, because I feel that like there's something missing in the West to cross that bridge. And I think that Edward Said was somebody that probably would have something very interesting to say. I wonder what you might think he might say about this moment, about Hamas, and about how to navigate this, even for people that have full solidarity with the Palestinian cause. What do you think he might say?
I think as a Palestinian who speaks English, of course, Edward Said is an idol. He gives us voice, gives us narrative. He helps us understand ourselves in relation to the West, in relation to the occupation. And of course, I grew up during my high school and universities reading Edward Said. Always just taking on all Edward Said thinking. But at this point in my life, for a while now, I have completely departed from Edward Said thinking. I am still an anti-colonial thinker, and I believe in anti-colonial, discourse and narrative. But I don't believe in the universe in any thing related to this idea of universality of human rights. Not that I don't believe that people are people and that they have a common human element that they all share together. I don't believe that that can be used as a foundation for political resolutions, for political solutions. Yeah, there's no such thing as just give me my rights. There's no such thing that in fact, in my opinion, there's no such thing as a right.
Right.
This is
you're critical of this notion that existing democratic liberal institutions can facilitate in rational, keyword rational, means the resolution of these injustices, and we can rely on these institutions to deliver things like collective liberation of Palestinians. You have a fundamental skepticism around this proposal, and you think that Said was himself ultimately committed to that paradigm.
Absolutely. As an avowed secular humanist thinker, I do think that he honestly missed the point. I mean, all his critique, I take on board and I fully embrace, not the conclusion. The conclusion of his critique that we can just live in a humanistic, secular country is just not feasible, and it's not grounded in the legitimate realities and humanity of the Palestinian on the ground in Palestine. This is not true. This is, again, another way where the hegemony of liberal universalism truly makes us unable to conceive and imagine ourselves as a people outside of the West, outside of Western discourse and outside of Western narrative. And it's not, what you described is true, but it's an understatement of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is not just that they cannot facilitate. What I'm saying is that they are the condition of possibility of the oppression of the Palestinian people. This discourse directly contributes to the subjugation of Palestinians by selling them the mirage of a future humanity, that in the future you will become fully human, that you're in the process of becoming human. Just keep working on it. That's what happens if you look at that statements, for example, just to give you an example of how now Biden or these liberal, and I say liberal, some people think when I say liberal, I'm not using the correct term, that these people are not liberal, they're deviation or of liberalism. They don't understand that this inherently and quintessentially what liberalism is. This is liberalism. This is not a deviation from liberalism. A lot of people, this is the ideology. That's why they take it personally when you criticize liberalism like that. They believe that they represent liberalism and that these people don't represent it. But then we ask, so is this liberalism? These kind of individual expressions of it, because these are depoliticized expressions of liberalism. This is moral. This is not political. It's individual morality. Liberalism is a political ideology, and as a political ideology, it's inherently racist, colonialist, and genocidal. So this is the history of liberalism, because liberalism tries to colonize the human category. It doesn't colonize just these people. People say, yeah, but Muslims colonized. Yeah, Muslim colonized. Everyone colonized everyone throughout history. The only distinctive feature of Western liberalism is not that it colonized other people. It colonized all of humanity by displacing, not just colonizing people on the ground, but colonizing the entire epistemology, the entire way, the fundamental way you can talk about humanity, saying that we're doing this in the name of humanity. We're doing this to humanize you, to civilize you. We're killing you, and if we have to kill you, because if ultimately you have to kill some people, then it's because you're not human. That's what's going on these days in Palestine. Hamas, Palestinians are enemies of what? Of humanity. This is the logical conclusion of liberal universalist narratives, is that it colonizes the human category, and when you find yourself having to fight against another people, then you have to expel them from the realm of humanity. That is, Muslims, Christians, Jews, all civilizations fought against each other. These were political fights. They fought each other against, because I'm, let's say, Muslim, and you're waging an attack on me as a Muslim, so people defend themselves, not because they don't see you as a human being. There was no such thing. This thing is intrinsic and distinctive to Western liberalism. And now what's going on is that it has culminated in this international liberal world order, where we claim that we're all in it together. We live in a world rules-based international law, but that's what I'm saying. It's based on the Zionist entity, where the concentration of global colonialism is simply expressed in the Zionist entity. We created this international world order, international institutions, the United Nations, right? After World War II, after the Holocaust. Now we can talk about the European issue here, this intra-European bloodshed that has been exported to Palestine, to the Holy Land, and the religious or monotheistic implications of this narrative. And then they created the United Nations, never again, of course, never again, and all of that. Now we have to talk about what happened in the region. Is that there was a regional power called the Caliphate. It got defeated in the First World War. Palestine became a British colony under British mandate. They gave it to Europeans. I won't say Jews, I'll say Europeans. Of course, European Jews, but the Europeans, not Jews, because there were Jews in Palestine, there are Jews in Yemen, there are Jews, Arabs, Africa, everywhere. This is not a Jewish thing. This is a colonial racial project, of course, that abuses Jewish history. They gave it to Europeans, and then the Nazis got were defeated in the Second World War, and then Israel was established, and then the new international world order came into existence, founded on the concentration of these colonial powers in the Zionist entity, Germany, Britain, and later on the United States. This is why the Zionist army is the army of the United States, of Australia, of Canada, of France. Who are these people? They're people, Europeans, who come from Europe and colonially settle on this land and fight against the native inhabitants of this land. And then when these people embrace their own history, because they understand truly that they're killing us, they're killing Palestinians because they're Arab and Muslim. And when they say that, they say, oh, they're terrorists, but they're going to kill you anyway. So this is where the liberal international world order cannot really facilitate your liberation, because it's the condition of possibility of your subjugation. Mm-hmm. This is why these people say, oh yeah, we sympathize with Palestinian civilians, but we don't sympathize with Israel, like I said, with the terrorists, with Hamas. But like I said, there's no such thing, because this is not about your morality. This is about the morality of morality here is taking sides. not to equivocate, not to say, yeah, on both sides. Yes, I understand that on a personal level, you know what? I'll tell you, even now as a Palestinian, I don't feel happy that some Israeli innocent people got killed on a personal level. But to be honest, politically, I still embrace in full the act of resistance that was waged by the Palestinians in Gaza against the Israeli Zionist state. Okay? You can maintain both positions at the same time. This is not about your morality, this is about the political. Here, morality has to be absolute, has to be you're with the victim, with the victimizer, the colonizer or the colonized. What we're talking about here, the Israeli Zionist entity or the people who are facing this genocide. To start then in a liberal fashion saying, well, I sympathize with the civilians in Gaza, is simply to be complicit in this genocide, because you're saying that Israel has a right to go after Hamas. Israel has no right to go after Hamas. Israel has no right to go and try and fight against Hamas. And Israel knows that there is no difference between, not because all Palestinians are Hamas in Gaza, but because Israel doesn't see a difference, because Hamas grows in Gaza, emerges from Gaza, is embedded in the refugee camps, the demographic, the geography, the genealogy of Gaza. This is one structure, one entity, one people. What the liberal narrative does is it depoliticizes you, fragments you, divides you, individualizes you, so you become a human rights issue. Individual civilians got killed. No, this is an Israeli genocide on the Palestinian, full stop, must stop. This is what's going on. Anyone who starts then talking about civilian militant narrative, as I said, they're more interested in upholding their individual morality, in feeling good about their own trying to uphold their ideology. This is what they're doing. They're not really facing the humanity of these people because they're detached from it. They want to uphold this myth of universal human that doesn't exist. That's the truth. Again, that doesn't mean that people are not human. People are human. They can relate to each other as human on the ground. They can meet, they can go down the pub, have a drink, they can have a coffee, they can talk. But there is no such thing as being human as a foundation for political community and political organizations. There's no such thing as, we're just a human community. All human community. The only way to be radically human is to understand that all people have their own ways of building their communities and organizing their communities. This is why, like I'm saying, when these people do have to acknowledge Palestinians as human beings, I'm talking about Biden and these people who are the official representatives of liberalism. These are the official representatives of liberal discourse, not the individual people on the ground who sympathize with Palestinians. And I'm here talking, as you can see, to liberals, not to Zionists. I have no interest in talking to Zionists or debunking Zionist narrative. We all know it's racist, colonialist, and genocidal. I'm talking to the liberals. If you truly want to support, as a Westerner, if you truly want to support Palestinians, you have to support them as a whole. And that's the challenge. Can you do that? And that's what I'm saying. They probably can't, because they're more interested in upholding their mythical universal humanity at the expense of the Palestinians. While they look at them and see them getting massacred, they still cannot embrace them and embrace their embodied humanity, not this universal idea that we are all in it together. So what they do when they have to acknowledge Palestinians as victims, they say, victims of human rights violations. What human rights violations? There's no such thing, I say, as the right to life. There is people who live, full stop. You don't have a right to life until your right to life has been violated. So this language of rights only kicks in retrospect when the right has become violated. So you violate someone's right, and then you tell them, you shouldn't have been killed. You have a right to life. You know what I'm saying? But people don't go, like in the West, they don't go around saying, I have a right to life. I have a right to freedom of movement. When do we invoke the language of rights? When those rights don't exist. When those rights are not actually there, because they're abstract rights. They're mythical rights that we use to subjugate other people. And that's what I'm saying. I don't believe in this kind of idea that the language of human rights can be, used to liberate Palestinians. In fact, it is the Trojan horse of the subjugation of the Palestinians, and only until Palestinians have completely renounced it, because it is used now nowadays by the official representatives of human rights and international law to exterminate and genocide the Palestinians in Gaza, because they have been deemed enemies of humanity. Why? Not because they're all terrorists, and not because Hamas is terrorist, but because they challenge that global colonial world order and their plan, or their basically historical project to colonize the human category. So what do they say? Yes, civilians. And you see the language, how they dehumanize Palestinians, and only when they acknowledge them, only in retrospect. So you're either a human to be in the future, at one point in the future, you might become human, but we know you won't. Or when you die, oh yeah, sorry, you were human and you were innocent, but you got butchered. And yeah, in the face of this, as a Palestinian, the only way to be Palestinian is to embrace the Palestinian resistance, to embrace Hamas. And as a Palestinian, I don't condemn Hamas, of course, because they're my family, they're my people, they're my neighbors, they're my friends, they're my family. And no Palestinian condemns Hamas. And if a Palestinian condemns Hamas, they're a victim. In fact, not only are they not our friends, they're our enemies. They become allies of the enemy. This is my discourse, and this is the only way I think Palestinians should talk about themselves.
What would you say to non-Palestinians that have full solidarity with the cause, but who face these issues? Because for me, I think that it's a kind of a double bind that you're put in, where you're forced to say, oh, well, if you stand for the universal emancipation of Palestinians, you're really a dupe, you're a fool of Hamas and their false narrative. Because if they are to be free, it can never happen under Hamas's control. So therefore, you should renounce your solidarity with them. What do you say to this issue? What do you say? Because that's what people in the US, in Europe, this is what they're getting, because all of these people are getting fired for not even for saying pro-Hamas things, but for saying pro-Palestinian things. They get fired.
I understand, and I'm not expecting anything from people, to be honest, Daniel. Listen, I'm such a pessimist. I've always been. When it comes as a political pessimist, I mean, not as an individual pessimist. This genocide, has been long in the making. It was always going to happen. Like I said, it's not the first genocide; it's the final genocide. I don't, when people sympathize and support Palestinians, I think that's great. That's admirable. Well done. Keep it up. Honestly, you guys are great and you're brave. Can you really liberate Palestinians? No, you can't. Like I said, because there's a fundamental problem with the world order, with the structure of the world order. This just face the truth that there is no such thing. I mean, that's what I'm saying. This is the real challenge. Will you finally accept that this narrative, can we stop talking about human rights and humanity? Not because I'm upset. People it's not like that I'm upset. That's why I'm saying I don't want human rights. No, I'm actually saying logically and philosophically, this is just illogical to talk about human rights. I find it amazing how we're looking at what's happening in Gaza and we still talk about human rights. This is kind of an error. It's kind of a mistake. We didn't really mean to kill you. It's kind of, an administrative error in the application of human rights. They don't understand that this is inherent to this liberal human rights narrative. It's not like a deviation. It's a continuation. It's logical. These people represent liberalism, which is colonialism, masked as universality. And Gaza, and why don't people think Hamas, Palestinians will not be free under Hamas? I don't understand what that's about. Hamas, like I said, personally, in Gaza, I can't be friends with them because we're not the same, the way we think, with the way we live our lives. But they're my people, what I'm saying? It's you, Daniel, you might have a right-wing friend or family member. You probably won't get along, but that doesn't make them not your family members. They're still your family members. If somebody tries to hurt them, you probably stand up for them and say, you can't hurt my brother or my cousin. So Hamas and I, in Gaza, a lot of people, when there is kind of no war, when they're not facing a genocide, they might, swear at Hamas, criticize Hamas, really say whatever they want about Hamas, which happens all the
And
time.
that's permissible. They're not going to be like put in jail or
No, unless, like I said, I mean, just like it's probably in the same degree that now people will be put in jail for criticizing Israel. So there's no difference here, qualitative difference.
so Hamas has repressive elements that we should not shy away from.
Only if you, by that you mean what Western governments do to their own
Oh no,
population.
what I mean to say is let's not paint, I'm not suggesting that you are, but let's not paint a rosy picture which would somehow suggest that Hamas is perfect or that like
No, as
yeah,
a government, not as a
it,
government,
as a
as
government.
a resistance group. Absolutely, from my opinion, they represent me to the fullest extent possible as a resistance group.
And is that true of Palestinians who are secular? Like you are a Muslim, you practicing Muslim, but for the Palestinians who are not, can you say something about their position? Is it
Uh,
is it more like, look, this is the reality, Hamas is where they are, there's no other choice at this point in time? Because I was listening to Al Jazeera today from the Palestinian Authority members, and it's obvious that they have to adhere to Hamas's hegemony now. It's everything has changed, everything has shifted.
that's true, and that's why honestly, it doesn't matter what we say. Everything will be decided on the ground by the resistance. This is the truth. We go on Twitter and we look, and I know my only consolation is that the resistance, it all hinges on the resistance. This is how crucial, how pivotal Hamas is to world history. Whether we like it or not, these are history makers. Okay, I'm not am I glorifying my resistance? Well, yeah, as a refugee Palestinian from Gaza, absolutely. I embrace this is my humanity. This is the only way I can be human. Not talking about human rights. By talking about human rights, I, divorce myself from my real embodied anchored humanity. My anchored humanity, my feelings, my body is with my family, my parents, my sister, my brother, my nephews, my nieces, my friends in Gaza right now facing genocide. Who should I be siding with as a human being? With my resistance to repel the invasion, to repel the enemy that has, for years since I came to this life, has oppressed me, colonized me, massacred me, people like me, my neighbors, bombed me, shelled me, did all kinds of oppression concentrated just to rob me of my humanity. Now I'm facing that. As we die, we will embrace our humanity. That is the slave revolution, if you want to call it a slave revolution. But I'm saying, do not underestimate the power of Hamas. I think it's a completely asymmetrical attack, not asymmetrical in the sense that it's like a strong state against a weak state. It's the most asymmetrical of asymmetrical wars. This is, people don't understand. They really need to fully imagine what's going on to understand what's happening in Gaza. Gaza is a very, very small strip of land. It's 40 kilometers long. So it's a marathon. You can run a marathon. Gaza, from far south to far north, is less than a marathon, the length of a marathon race. From east to west, it's between 8 and 12 kilometers. So it's a short race. This is all of the Gaza Strip. All of the Gaza Strip is a very small strip of land. Look at the map of Palestine, which all of Palestine is small piece of land, like on the global level. Imagine Gaza, how small that is. It's densely populated, full of refugee camps, very large refugee camps that are industrial refugee camps that have existed now since 1948, where people got kicked out and then they refused to leave Palestine. They wanted to stay close.
Not tents, but tenements, like blocks, like
yeah.
Not,
Exactly, not tents, basically concrete buildings.
right.
Yeah, residential buildings. They're not fancy, they're ugly, all of them.
Yeah.
But people are, growing, and there's
you said your parents are there now?
All of my family are there. All of them, every single one of them. I'm the only person from my family who's not in Gaza, because I left Gaza in 2015, never returned, almost knowing that something of this nature was going to happen, having seen what I've seen. So What happened here is that, yes, I embrace Hamas, I embrace my resistance, and I'm telling you, this is the most asymmetrical of asymmetrical wars. This is a war between people truly fighting for the humanity, not of Gaza, of the world, against, because we know, like I'm saying, the 99, you said that, people who agree and who criticize, and I know that these people, like I'm saying, you're brave, you're heroic, do what you're doing. It's important to challenge these people and put pressure on your governments. But at the same time, let's also start finally understanding the scale and the historical significance of this. And, in a sense, understand how what Gaza's fighting for is not just the humanity of Gaza, but against the global colonialist agenda. So what we're fighting for is global humanity, all of humanity, which is being oppressed and colonized in our name. These people, these leaders, Macron, Biden, all of them, what they're doing is that they're killing people in our name, in the name of our humanity. And that's the humanity that I'm talking about, that we share together, not as a political, foundation, as a political narrative, because we see how the political narrative of humanity is used to exterminate people. Now we moralize it and try and collectivize and build and mobilize and put pressure. But this, even, I mean, as you can see, nothing is happening because they have their own, they set the agenda, they know what they want, and they're gonna go and, push for it, which is eradicate Gaza.
So you've said twice or three times that this is a final solution. Okay. Hamas they are known to be fierce. Two questions. Tell me a little bit about their fierceness, and do you have any confidence that they will be able to push them back? Number one. Number two, why have Muslim countries not sent in forces, including Hezbollah? It is a shame. I mean, it baffles me to be able to witness what we see on the media, even though, by the way, the Western media is not even allowed into Gaza. They've killed some 50 plus journalists already. So we only see a sliver of what's happening. This is happening under a blackout now. It's continual blackout. Sometimes they get electricity, then it goes away, and so on and so on. So tell me about can you be optimistic regarding this fight?
I know it's not going to be an easy fight for the Zionist state. That's what I know. I know that they know that. They know in 2014, that was the last time they tried to invade Gaza, through ground incursion operations. It was a heavy, the only way Israel can kill Palestinians is from the air, truly. That's what they do, that's what they understand, and that's what they've been doing. They can't truly face the Palestinian resistance on the ground. That's what I'm saying you. When I say they're heroes, I am being objective. Because in a real battle, if they talk about the idea of self-defense, right? I'm happy with that. Let's fight. Let's do self-defense. Classic, old-fashioned self-defense. Bring your troops. We give you Hamas. You fight each other. Leave the civilians out of it. Huh? Why do they have to use the heavy aerial bombardment, methods to exterminate Hamas, when Hamas is, just, they're all along the fence, along the so-called border. Just go. The problem is they know. For them, this is not something that they can afford. Go on.
Hamas would obliterate them in the ground gun battle.
I wouldn't say obliterate. They will lose a lot of people, but they don't. Honestly, they're fearless. They fight these people. This is how they galvanize Islamic. These people truly believe in God more than they believe in themselves. You're dealing with a different kind of human being. That's what
many of their family have been killed by Israel.
Well, yeah. Now, if you want to go to the materialistic, of course, the materialistic, grounds of this, of course, all of them are traumatized. All they know is oppression, is violence, is killing. For them, like I said, the idea of liberation is to fight. Like their dream is to confront Israeli soldiers. not Israeli civilians. I'm telling you, the fighters. Yeah, now sometimes you might get attacks against Israeli civilians in the West Bank. These are, kind of the lonesome attacks that you get out of desperation. This is not a desperation act. This is a resistance act by professional fighters who really don't want to kill civilians. They want to kill soldiers. They want to fight soldiers. I'm telling you, you want to defend yourself, invade. This is they know that they can't do it, because I told you in 2014 they obliterated Gaza from the air. Then they tried to invade Gaza. It was a complete debacle. It was a complete embarrassment. They lost so many soldiers, and we abducted an Israeli. The resistance abducted an Israeli soldier. Every time there is some sort of an invasion, the resistance is able to ambush them in a way that not only do they inflict heavy losses on them, on their soldiers, tanks, and all of that. I mean, we're talking about urban warfare, and we're talking about Gaza, which is very small, and we're talking about people who have been in control of Gaza for 20 years, completely isolated from the whole world. Yes, have they, as a militant group, have they entrenched their militant capacity beyond what we can imagine? Now, whether you like that or not, it's up to you. But this was the only way we could continue to exist as a people. Like I said, it's not the time to go back and say, oh, should they have done that or not done that? I'm not in that position. I'm in this position where Hamas has launched this attack on behalf of me as a people, and Israel is retaliating by exterminating all of us. And of course, Hamas here is part and parcel of the Palestinian community, and it represents the Palestinian people by its sort of ability to, again, wage self-defensive acts, war against the Zionist invasion. Now, do I have confidence? Absolutely. Does that mean I don't, of course, Israel may well be able to invade Gaza and isolate the north from the south, which is the plan, to divide Gaza through the middle, take over the north, and treat everyone who's still in the north as Hamas, just raise the entire northern part, wipe it off, and take over through ground troops and all of that. It will be a fierce battle. I don't think the Israeli army has the resolve to wage this kind of attack, because it will be absolutely deadly for the Israeli soldiers. You're dealing with Hamas, I'm saying, after 20 years of entrenching themselves in the refugee camps in Gaza. The Israeli army has been, of course, they understand how difficult and how, unprecedented this is for them, trying to invade Gaza. And, if they wanted to take over Gaza, they would have left it in the first place. They just left it, and then they gave it to Hamas. And now after 20 years, they want to take, I don't think that's a logical thing for them, sort of, and they will understand what they're doing is just they're retaliating. They're blinded by their, trauma, by their vengeance. And of course, Netanyahu set an unrealistic plan, if we want to speak in diplomatic terms, an unrealistic goal, which is to get rid of Hamas. That was an impulsive reaction, because we know he just wanted to save his face. Hamas having truly, brought about his demise as the last leader of the Zionist entity, the last being the last Zionist genocidal leader. And Hamas having done what it did, simply, struck a fatal blow into the heart of the occupation. We're talking about the moral significance, the political, historical, and moral significance of the attack, and whether Hamas was justified to launch it, not the technicality and what happened exactly. And even though that we can discuss that too, because so far we haven't seen evidence of those brutalities. I don't care if the liberals think that they have the monopoly on facts, and just because Israel said it or it's called Hamas, then it means it's true. They're not really interested in beheading and raping. This is, for me, just pure, I'm sorry to say this, but pure filthy racism. Like, what is this kind of raping babies? These people, I'm telling you, they live their whole life waiting to confront the enemy. They kiss their mother's hand before they go and fight, because they want to go to heaven. They know they're gonna die. They don't know they're gonna die, and they're Muslim. They're gonna go inside Israel. Like, logically think about it. And now after they wage the attack and they engage the army, and they rape babies, like, this is the extent of like how vacuous Zionist propaganda is, which liberals will still be willing to engage with and entertain, because it's Hamas. So Hamas is always kind of suspicious and skeptical because they're Muslims and Arabs and they use arms and they're that's what I'm saying. There is underlying racism.
No. Its function was to justify the aerial genocidal bombardment. That's the function.
Absolutely.
No, but
Absolutely.
why have the Muslim powers in Lebanon, which, what is it, 20% of the region of Lebanon now is controlled by Hezbollah? Why have they not acted? When is it going to be adequate for them to come and help? I mean, I know you don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. I mean,
yeah,
you're just an academic and so on and so forth. But like, what do you think? Like, because this is unprecedented. And I also want to ask you about the prospect of the uprising of the young people in the West Bank. But first, let me ask you about the regional thing. Yeah.
The regional thing is probably what Hamas has. This is where I worry that Israel might be able to achieve its mission. In that sometimes we still have a little bit of faith in the Arab and Muslim leadership. So I do think militarily Hamas would have planned and anticipated this kind of response, but I don't think they would have planned and anticipated this kind of apathy and complete disengagement from the genocide of Arab and Muslim people in Gaza. This is where I feel this may be the tragic flaw of Hamas, not having calculated that they might have to do this all alone and all by themselves. So it will literally be Gaza against the whole world, and it is Gaza against the whole world. So I have said it before, I do think that Hamas made two mistakes. First, overestimated the military capability or strength of the Israeli army. When they planned their attack, they actually thought that they were going to engage in this kind of a serious battle with the Israeli defense. And then in 2 hours, the Israeli defense establishment fell apart. And then everything just became chaos. And, everything happened. That was the first flaw, that they overestimated their strength. The second is that they overestimated the diplomatic support or the kind of diplomatic gestures that might be extended towards them from Arab and Muslim countries. All it takes is for Egypt to open the border, just get some food and water. They told him, the Hamas military wing spokesperson, Abu Ubaidah, we don't want you to fight. We don't want you to send weapons. Don't worry. That's our job. We plan for that. But we just, your children, because they're your children, they speak your language, your religion, they look like you, they're yours, are being massacred and they're thirsty. And all you have to do is open the border and let some water. Like, this is the extent of the conspiracy of the kind of war, the global colonialism that Hamas is being faced with now, that Hamas is fighting against. How all of this collective has truly come together and united in order to exterminate Hamas, because for them, Hamas is the real threat. Hamas is a threat to the powers in Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, to Egypt, to generally the Arab autocratic leaderships, and they have they already kind of eliminated.
So they are a threat because they have a moral resistance to the complicity that the Muslim leaders already have with the Western capitalist order. Is this the idea you're saying? That they
No, it's simpler than this. It's a more of an internal threat. They pose popular threat. They're Islamists. They're democratic. They're truly democratic in the sense that they were chosen by the people, and if people have had a chance to vote, they would vote for people like Hamas. So this is what happened here when we talk about regional developments in the Arab Spring. So this is connected with the Arab Spring, very connected, because when the Arab Spring happened, in the wake of the Arab Spring, the elections took place, and most of the elections yielded basically Islamist outcomes. Like people voted for Islamist parties, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya. All those countries had revolutions, and in the aftermath of all those revolutions, people voted for Islamist parties, political Islam. Now, that lasted only 1 or 2 years before the counter-revolution happened. And the counter-revolutions were sponsored by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, the autocratic leaders of the Arab regimes who perceived and correctly perceived a threat in political Islam, and have always perceived a threat on them. Like I said, the first threat of political Islam towards these leaders happened in the 1970s. And of course, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. But I don't want to go into Sunni Shia divisions here. So I'm just talking about Islam in general and the popular revolt, Islamic popular revolt, and how whenever there is some sort of a free election or democratic representation, eventually the leadership will be grounded in Islamic principles, because this is the history of the region. Now I don't necessarily agree with these Islamic parties. By the way, I'm not myself. When I say that, I don't say that as a practicing Muslim. I only became a practicing Muslim lately. But I don't say that as a practicing Muslim. I say that as an Arab and a Muslim from the region. I'm, as someone, honestly, as an objective observer, my voice here is the voice of an analyst from Gaza, a subaltern voice, not someone who just wants to parrot the discourse, or someone who just wants to give you an abstract analysis. It's an embodied analysis of what's going on here. This is why Hamas is the last sort of expression of popular resistance, popular revolt. Now, for those Arab regimes, autocratic Arab regimes, to sponsor the counter-revolutions, particularly in Egypt, when they sponsored the military coup by the current dictator, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, so he is basically a stooge in the hands of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, but mainly of the United Arab Emirates, which is the biggest enemy for them, the biggest enemy is political Islam. Their whole intelligence apparatus is geared towards the elimination of all kinds of expressions of political Islam in the United Arab Emirates, because of course it's the idea of a liberal, open, international hub, and therefore political Islam is always seen as a threat to it, because it destabilizes this kind of internationalism, this neoliberalism, the open free world where the last man, no more politics. Hamas keeps that alive, and political Islam generally, and Hamas is the last expression of political Islam that is still around. Now they have understood.
You say there has such a political, economic, material component to it, insofar as, or does it, like insofar as like there are existing linkages to the global capitalist economy that the Gulf states, including Saudi, have to keep this balance. They have to keep it maintained. Whereas the Islamist orientation will necessitate, if they were to gain power, like a domino theory, if like they gain power, that's what they want to avoid, then the whole region would be under a new management. But here's the caveat. The Islamist view on integration into global capitalist economy is not necessarily, and you correct me if I'm wrong, like a socialistic one. Like that, you see my point? They're not necessarily going to be conceiving. They probably, like Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, were conciliatory to capitalism. They're fine with being entrepreneurs and entering into the global economy and so on and so forth. So that's, I'm just curious, like quickly, if you could say something regarding this. Like I know that Arab communism and that whole period was short-lived in the 20th century, and it's kind of dead. But is there some truth to this notion that Islamists do rival the political economy? A lot of left-wing philosophers today, I don't need to name names, they will say something like, because in 1979, when Iranian Revolution happened, a lot of the Western philosophers said, well, it's Shia Islam, which is emancipatory, Sunni Islam is progressive, and so on and so forth. Now, I think in more recent times, people have tried to make a claim that Islamism, under Sunni orientation in general, has the trappings of being kind of somehow having a hostility to integration into the global capitalist, like you said, the end of history, right? Like there's a kind of position that some have argued that, but nonetheless, what Islamism does not have is a foundational orientation on being anti-capitalist. Maybe some do, but it's not necessarily a part of their collective program. Your thoughts on this?
I will answer the question, even though I feel I should not because like I said, I don't really want to engage in purely abstract intellectual debate at this point. I'm using this interview as a way to truly defend my people, to present a perspective on people in Gaza, on Hamas being the forefront of Palestinian resistance against the Zionistic occupation of Palestine. And however, I do think it's important to answer the question, in order to also highlight really the significance of what's going on in Palestine, because that is connected to what you're talking about, directly connected. Now, this question pertains to the positive models of governance that Islamist parties will enact, assuming that they rise to power in their societies. All right. So this is a question, in fact, just simply speaking, this is a question for the future, not for the present. At this present moment, the only political question is a question of survival, the question of self-defensive war against global colonialist forces that are waging an attack on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. And this is the most political form of resistance, not enacting particular economic and governance models, that some people might construe as emancipatory or not emancipatory. Now, why is this important? Just to answer the question rather than evade it. Political Islam in general, as you mentioned earlier, and I probably didn't answer the question directly, is diverse. It includes various elements, various expressions from the apolitical Sufi and Salafist apathy, because there's no other word, we see mainly in the religious ulama of Saudi Arabia these days, who go on television and say, well, tough luck, it's bad luck, what's happening to Palestinians. These are the official authoritative narratives. That's why I'm saying even this war is a war for Islam, not for humanity. It's for Islam and therefore for humanity. Because, like I'm saying, this is my historical monotheistic view on what's going on, and we'll come back to the idea of the economy and material history. So, because also this is also where the secular narrative again makes it hard for us to articulate any idea unless we detach ourselves from these kind of so-called religious, because there is this kind of explicitly sharp distinction between what is material and what is religious, as if what is religious is not material and is just spiritual and sort of the afterlife, it's heaven. No. In a truly religious narrative, not religious in the sense that it's opposed to secular, in a truly religious narrative, there is no such distinction between the material and the spiritual. So those religious ulama in Saudi Arabia now, who are the authoritative voices of Islam, when I say authoritative, I mean in a juristic sense, the jurists, the ulama, the legal trivia, in my opinion. It's nonsense, because the most political form of identification with Islam at this point in time is to support Palestinians who are Muslims and Arabs getting killed by global colonialist forces. What these people do is that they find whatever historical precedent and justification to explain to themselves their own apathy and their own impotence and inability to truly defend other Muslims by, in fact, participating in the dehumanization campaign that is led by Zionist and liberal forces against them. So they say that, for example, our rulers, we have to obey the rulers because they're apathetic politically. They think that they, it's the ulama, it's the leader, for example, the Saudi prince that represents them. And if the Saudi prince deemed it antithetical to their interest or to the interests of the ummah, because they believe that the ummah still exists, they don't understand that there is no such thing as ummah. The ummah is not just a fragmented nation state model. The ummah is a true political manifestation, and that doesn't exist these days. So they go on justifying their apathy and their impotence, and they say, and they believe in their Islamic identity. They truly believe that this is what God, wants us to do. They just want to fast and pray, but this is meaningless, because what's the point of fasting and praying when your Muslim brothers and sisters are being persecuted, and they can't fast and pray because they can't live. This is when you read the history of Islam, it's a political history. It's the history for survival.
But they have some Salafi scholars have the position that because the occupation is so brutal, it is better that the Palestinians give it up so that they can make a community of worship safely and well, right? Which is a very minor opinion, but it is nonetheless interesting to show you the full spectrum of these. Yeah.
There is worse as well. There is some who actually justify Zionism using the Quran. I called it Arab Zionism, and it's now kind of a common term, to be honest. Arab Zionism, which was again mainly led by the current Saudi prince, to normalize relations with Israel, to get rid of Palestinian resistance, and that's what I'm saying. They're waging this genocide, and they're directly complicit and actively.
That paradigm is now over. In your maybe that's too optimistic.
Nah, only it depends on the battle. Like I'm saying, everything hinges on Hamas, on the resistance in Palestine. If they stand their ground and they repel the occupation, they have to deal with Hamas, and Hamas and Palestinians will be there. But there is the real existential threat at this moment that Hamas will not be eradicated, but will be, defanged in a sense. So it depends on the battle, and that's why we're following closely what's happening on the ground now. And as the occupation forces try to invade and they are still being repelled, they are unable to make any progress. They are confused, they're fragmented, the leadership that doesn't know what they're doing, they're fighting against each other, they're trying to absolve each other of responsibility for the Hamas attack. They're killing civilians. That's the only Zionist policy. Always take it on the civilians, take it on the children of journalists, on the journalists themselves, on the paramedics, on the hospitals. This is the only way they can sell a victory to their people, because they can't so far make any advances on the ground. So it all depends on the ground. Now, what happens is, like I said, there is the apathetic political Islam. Then there is the more kind of Hamas, right? Or political Islam that is truly political because it's democratic. And there is, of course, the jihadist, the terrorist, the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and all that. Now, we talked about the Salafist. They're not political. They're just conservative traditionalists who just want to, follow the legal, the rules, the law, and also always sort of, pretend that the law still makes sense and is relevant, even though the reality and the political fundamental political context within which the law becomes meaningful is simply non-existent anymore, which is the context of an anchored political community, a caliphate, in the sense that a geopolitical community where there is peace and order, where people can truly go about living their lives in an Islamic way. These people want, of course, to internationalize and liberalize, but still sort of maintain this kind of connection with God. And then, how Islam is, simply becomes legal trivia. Whether there's gelatin in lollies and should I give it to my child or not. This is Islam these days. But then you have on the other extreme the political expression of Islam, most represented now in Hamas, given that it is fighting for not Palestinians, for Muslim land. Hamas, when it waged its attack, and this is something we haven't mentioned so far, it waged its attack not just against the oppression of Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank, mainly in East Jerusalem. This is the driving this is the real fundamental issue for Hamas, Jerusalem, and the constitutive Islamic status of Jerusalem for Muslim history. Jerusalem is as much of a holy place for Muslims as it is for Jews, real Jews, not Zionists, real religious Jews, not those who abuse Jewish history to occupy Palestinian land. So when Hamas fights, she fights for Muslims. She fights for Muslim history. She fights for Muslim dignity. And that's their discourse. That's why they pose a threat to these autocratic national regimes, which want to keep the Muslim world fragmented so that they can maintain their own regional power and legitimacy again in the eyes of their own populations. Now, in terms of if Hamas, hypothetically, an Islamist party rises to power, the question here, this is where I diverge fundamentally from all political Islamist projects that exist now, because they are still caught up, or they are still entrapped within the nation-state model, within the governance model in which they believe that I can just, my goal should be to take over the state, become the government, and then Islamize society by enacting or introducing an Islamic constitution. That's not an Islamic society. That's still a secular society in a religious form, in an Islamic form, but that Islamic form is not truly Islamic because it's still a legal form. It's not a political form. The true political Islamic expression is a geopolitical expression. So this is the problem with these governance models, is that they're fixated on how to imbue the existing society with an Islamic character, not to construct a whole new society. They want to take over Egypt and then Islamize Egypt by, introducing Sharia, for example, or whatever, Islamic constitution in Pakistan. And, this is where they fail, because their project is self-defeating, because you're working within the boundaries of the secular nation-state model, which is simply a secular model, because you're defined as a secular by reference to your secular identity, your materialistic national ethnic identity, not as a geopolitical Islamic community. Once the truly Islamic project is a project that should aim for establishment of a geopolitical community that cuts across these racial, ethnic and national differences, these nation states can continue to exist. In my estimation, I don't think they can be removed. They can continue to exist, but what you'll need then is some sort of an alliance similar to what we have in the European Union, where it's not an impotent alliance I'm talking about. I'm talking about a real political, military, and economic alliance where, for example, there is free movement across borders in these nation states, where they can concentrate their power, where they know they define each other as friends, not as enemies, and they understand who their enemy is. And then that's where I believe you can start providing a new real governance, a new alternative governance model, not a model within the existing nation state. That's when the law becomes meaningful. That's when people can be democratic and free and actually have freedoms and live and drink and do whatever they want, because you live under the shade of a global regional power, like a global power that maintains peace and order, that people can travel, can move around, can have political representations in the United Nations, where you can have economic peace treaties, you can migrate like people do in the United States, like people do in the European Union. We don't have that, and I'm saying we don't have that because we have Israel. So the fight against Israel is the fight against global colonialism in the region, and that's the real political Islamic model.
Yeah, what you're articulating kind of does bring us back to the exact point we started, which, because I hear so many resonances with Professor Salman Said in his conceptualization of a particular way of thinking about Muslim governance in this notion of rethinking the caliphate, his 2014 text. And I know your vision seems pretty singular and perhaps not exactly aligned with his. You have different things, but what I hear you saying, and what I think perhaps we don't have the time to get into now, but maybe in a future conversation, would be the necessity for, especially in the wake of this genocidal madness that we're living with now, for Muslims to be able to have the self-determination to realize something like this, to realize a community that would provide the basic dignity and security for life, for the who is going to assure the Palestinian people that this will not happen again? How's
Or
that?
any other people, or any other Muslim.
Or any other people.
Yeah.
We are creating a new cycle of never again discourse. So it's a monstrous situation, and I want to close, Mohammed. And maybe I can invite you back in the future. We can discuss that. We've opened up that very interesting horizon, because it's very difficult for Muslims in the West. I work with Muslims closely in the West. It's very difficult to be so politicized, your subjectivity to be so politicized, right? For you, we already talked about this question of the subjectivity of the Gazan, which is different than the subjectivity of the Palestinian in the West Bank. My God, it's fundamentally different than the Muslim in America. So when the American Muslim or whatever, European, learns of this particular way of conceiving of political Islam, it actually does not always resonate with them. And they fall back more in support of a liberal model. Like between me and you, I once was hired as an ombudsman, a mediator between two groups of Muslims. And this may trouble you, but I was hired to resolve a dispute between a group of American Muslims that went to Israel, okay, under a educational institution called the Shalom Hartman Institute. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's a progressive Zionist group. And anyways, it's kind of a brainwashing effort. And I interviewed the Zionist leaders, the educators, the Muslims that went, and then all the Muslims that protested them going. And this was in 2013. And it split the community. It's a whole other story, but it was very interesting to see the way of the politicization and the attractiveness of the liberal Islamic thing. It's very attractive to people in the West, to Muslims. I've seen this myself, just as a little anecdote. But
No,
please. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Are you familiar with this?
I am. I lived in Australia now for 9 years, so I know what a first world Muslim looks like. Not to undermine or to sort of mock, but it is not the same.
It's not.
They are truly like, and this is global colonialism again. That it encompasses everyone. It depoliticizes everyone. In that sense, we all become just individuals. That's what I'm saying. Everything, religion, culture, these become just mere facets, they lose significance. They become trivial matters, trivial differences. That's what because we have a common humanity, and that's the real political identification. But I'm saying that's not the political identification. The real political identification is you being Muslim, being brown, being this, being that. And of course, that depends on the particular situation you're in. So you can have multiple political subjectivities in different situations, but there is no such thing as being human. The only way you're human is when you're not being treated as a human being. So, but this is what liberalism does. This is what capitalism does. This is what, it individualizes us. So we all just become concerned with our individual morality, with how to reconcile our material reality with our sort of, I live and I work for a Western government. I need to buy a house. Should I take a loan? But that will be interest, and interest is haram. So how do I go around that? So, I go to an Islamic banking system. Again, I'm not against that, but that's not Islam, in my opinion. That's the trivialization. That's the reduction of Islam to its legal articulation, devoid of its political significance, which is its most primary foundation. That is Islam. So for me now, what we have is, I don't know, like how to express it, but it's a compartmentalized form of Islam. It's kind of a reduced, diluted Islam that, there are Muslims, but there is no Islam, in my opinion. Islam in the hearts of the people, but not Islam as a political and historical force.
Yeah. And that's very, very powerful. I want to return to the, in closing, almost 2-hour conversation. Thank you so much. Moving forward, we cannot make any real predictions. We pray for the safety of your family, first and foremost. I hope everyone survives this brutal genocide. any final thoughts regarding what my listeners, people that are going to be in solidarity with the Palestinian cause? We have a major protest in Washington, D.C., where I live, in a few days. Is your thing, I mean, I see many people say ceasefire, ceasefire now, ceasefire now. Your thoughts on...
Yes, please, ceasefire. Absolutely. Nobody wants, to have their loved ones murdered. We are political, but we're human beings as well. That's why we're political. We want a ceasefire, and because I'm outside Gaza anyway, so I have the luxury of, speaking to you right now. I'm not there. I'm not facing the genocide. This needs to stop. It's for me. Like I said, the only solace I have in this is that I'm a true. I'm a monotheist. I believe that this is about God fundamentally. Like I said, I don't mince words because I shouldn't, because people should be offended by the reality of the world that we live in, not by my words. And I believe that this is a war on monotheists, on believers in Palestine. The only way that these people can find solace is by reorienting themselves towards God, to the sky, to not towards humanity. They have stopped. They know that humanity is their enemy. That they know that they are, and I truly used this term for the first time 2 years ago, the anti-human. They are the enemy of humanity. But the true enemy of humanity is humanity, because they are the enemies of these people's humanity. So it's a fight between humanities.
And they're acting in the name of humanity.
Of course, but it's the powerful humanity. It's what all people actually fall into. It's what people want to salvage, this mythical universal humanity. So I'm telling people the only way you can be universally human is to just acknowledge and accept that all people are human. You don't have to affirm that. I will never say that even the people who are massacring me now are not human. It doesn't matter what you say. Whether you say they're human or not, they are. That's a matter of facticity. That's not a value judgment. The problem is we want to attribute a value judgment to what it means to be human. So, but they are human. Yes, for me, they are a degenerate kind of human being, is the Zionist army that wages those assaults on our people. But they are human beings. They're different kind of human than me. So the only way to be universally human is to acknowledge that everyone's human, and to be truly political in the sense that you side with the goodness of the people, with the justness of the people that you believe represent justness and goodness, and represent, a fight, not a political fight that you feel aligns with you as a material embodied human subject, not as an ideological subject. Truly empathize and sympathize with the people to understand their reality on the ground and what they're facing, and either side with them or against them. And don't, liquidate and don't equivocate and engage with these narratives of what and but and if and all that, because that again fuels and plays into the Zionist propaganda, which continues to exterminate our people. Last night, just every morning we saw just truly deliberately targeting. It's crazy what they do. It's indescribable, unspeakable, just launching these missiles, thousands of tons of explosives on a tiny strip of land that is overcrowded, densely populated, militarily besieged for 20 years, with nearly 4,000 children. People think that that's not in other countries they will tell you, well, a lot of people got killed, but they understand it's the extremity of violence. It's not just the sheer number. It's not a numbers game. It's not a statistical issue. It's the sheer violence, the sheer vengeance of each strike, of each attack, the way they launch these missiles towards over-concentrated, like it's a concentrated population, and now that population is even further doubly concentrated because half of them had to move towards the south. So you imagine the concentration, you imagine the density of the people when you strike and you send those tons of explosives on children and women. This is where you need to understand the hatred, the full negation of humanity, not the genocide between, for example, Serbs and Bosniaks. This is not that. This is not sort of two people, one is dehumanizing the other. No, this is all of humanity dehumanizing a group of people. This is the Jewish European, this is the European, white European dehumanization of the Arab, of the Muslim, and of course the Jewish Zionist dehumanization of the Arab. So there is two layers of dehumanization here, and that's expressed in the extremity of violence, in the sheer vengeance with which they, like I'm saying, last night, a wedding hall, tens of people directly assaulted with tens of missiles, fully obliterated in the full sense of the word, that they just nothing exists. This is what we're dealing with here. This is what people
no bodies.
Nothing. The word I read by people, and the person who reported it is now dead on Twitter. The person who reported that attack on Twitter is now, a few hours later, himself dead, having been murdered.
You said, I think this is important because the media apparatus will be trying to conflate Jewishness with Zionism and things of this nature. We never know the extent to which they will go to do this. I think it is important that people understand, because you put something on Twitter a few hours ago, maybe one day ago, that the closest brother in humanity for you is a Jewish person who renounces these activities. I thought you might want to say something about that. It's very powerful.
Yeah, of course. As I'm saying, this is not about Jew Muslim. Yes, we Jews and Muslims are historically connected. We're monotheists. This is about Abraham. This is about Isaac. This is about Ishmael. This is about Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Muslims and Jews are historically connected. They're brothers, Jews and Muslims. This is the Zionist abuse of Jewish history, which is a fundamentally racial colonialist European project that started in Europe, designed, planned, and orchestrated from Europe to colonize this region by taking over the Holy Land, giving it to the Jewish population in Europe because they were victimized by other Europeans, to atone for the guilt, for the sin, historical sin, which is the Holocaust being the last, not the first, because Jews were historically persecuted in Europe by European Christians. And again, Christians here being a political history, not an individual identification with Christianity. In Spain, after the Muslim Caliphate in Spain was defeated by the Christian conquest of the Reconquista. So then the Jews were persecuted en masse, forcibly converted into Christianity. Before that, they lived peacefully and coexisted organically, brothers with the Muslims. We have the philosopher Maimonides, who lived and exchanged and wrote and drew on Islamic history, on the Quran, Averroes, Avicenna. This is one history.
Even in the caliphate under the Turkish Ottomans, up to World War I, as you said before, there were Jewish communities embedded in the Muslim society.
And Christian and Muslim. This is true. This is real tolerance, organic tolerance, not ideological diversity and inclusivity. This is real, the structure on the ground being organic. Then these people came to atone, but at the same, so that's the theological element of it, the hegemonize, sort of the abuse of Jewish history by a certain segment of Europe, of Jewish people in Europe. So that's important to understand that it's double. First Jewish, or first European and white, and that's the hatred of Christian Zionists that we see as well. Because these people support Zionism because they see themselves as fighting against Muslims. And of course, we understand the Christian consciousness first emerged in response to the first Muslim attack, defeat, that the Crusaders received in Jerusalem. This is the holy significance, the monotheistic significance of the struggle and of the fight, the genocide that is being waged on Gaza, that of course you will never hear in these public secular liberal discourses.
Mohammed, it's been an honor to talk with you at a historical moment such as the one we find ourselves in. To think 3 weeks ago, we would never have had this conversation. This is truly one of the most important conversations I've had on this program. Thank you so much. And I pray for the safety of your family, of the Palestinian people, of the end of this conflict, and for the justice of the oppressed. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Dan.
Let us do it again in the future, and
Absolutely.
we will stay in touch. We'll let everybody know how they can find you on social media and things of that nature as well.
No worries, Daniel. Thanks for having me. And yeah, keep us in your prayers.
Thanks, everybody.